I could, of course, give a talk that was really historical, that would talk about what is happening in our field of study at the moment, because a lot of things, exciting things, are happening in the universities. We've seen new research on the history of slavery in the Dutch Empire, studies on slavery in Asia. That's a topic that has not been explored at all. Work on slavery in theater, very recent PhD thesis on slavery in Dutch early modern theater, and I could go on with well, exciting work that's coming out. But I want to talk with you about something else, and that is the public debate that has been going on about slavery in the Netherlands. And I'm going to share my screen now and share with you my PowerPoint presentation. And the presentation has a lot of images. Let me see. Are. I think even abroad in the UK, you could see that something is up in the Netherlands when it comes to the history of slavery and our public debate. I can't move my. Okay. For example, the Guardian had several newspaper articles on the Rijksmuseum exhibition. This is the entrance to the exhibition on slavery, and it's officially opening tomorrow. And the Guardian had several articles about this exhibition. You see here the entrance, and in the entrance they have bells that are bells that were used on plantations to tell time, to start the day and to end the day. One of those bells is actually from St. Catherine's College in Cambridge, where it was donated to by a former plantation owner, I think, in Guyana. And it had been hanging in Cambridge for a long time. And when Cambridge started to think about the history of slavery, that bell popped up as a possible connection to that history. I think it's very nice that it's hanging as part of the exhibition and shows us the international and imperial ties that are. Another piece in the Guardian was on this exhibition. An exhibition in the National Archive that is also opened last week on the slave revolt in Berbice, a colony also in the Guyanas in the 18th century. Had a big slave uprising, and a beautiful book by Marjoleine Kars, published last year, Blood on the River. And they have a small exhibition, so your newspaper also covered that. Another one, a piece in that paper today, was about the city of Amsterdam and the announcement that the city of Amsterdam is going to hand out studies of the history of slavery of Amsterdam, a study that had been conducted last year. And here you see the mayor of Amsterdam, Femke Halsema, and the alderman, Rutger Groot-Wassink. And they both hold the first copies of that book, and the editorial team is behind there, and many of the colleagues contributed short introductory pieces summarizing the state of the art of our understanding of the connection of the city of Amsterdam to slavery. And now we're at the point that the city has said, well, we're going to print so many copies of this book that everybody in Amsterdam can have a free copy if they want to. Also, the New York Times noticed that the Dutch are talking about the history of slavery. There was a piece on the Mauritshuis exhibition in 2019, where the Mauritshuis housed in a building built by Johan Maurits van Nassau-Siegen, partly paid for by the sugar trade, but now housing the most important, the largest collection of 17th century Golden Age Dutch art. And this museum investigated its ties to historical slavery and had an exhibition about it, as well as the, of course, there also the opening of the museum. And interestingly, the exhibition that's opening in 2 weeks in the Amsterdam Museum about the Golden Carriage. And here you see the Golden Carriage, which is a carriage that is used once a year by our head of state, either the king or a queen, and they use it to go to the place where they read the address to Parliament. And 5 years ago, the Golden Carriage was taken in for renovations, has not been used for 5 years, and is going to present it to the public now. And it will be exhibited first at the Amsterdam Museum. And the king has said that he wants to have a conversation about the question, should it still be used or not? And how should we understand what is displayed, for example, on the side of that carriage. And so you get the sense that there is a lot going on, and that there is a lot of attention and a lot of debate. And many people also feel that everything is so new, that this is something that has not been done before, that we never knew anything about the history of slavery, and finally we're beginning to address it, and finally we're beginning to come to terms to it. And it's quite funny how, of course, as historians, we can take a step back and we can see, well, this has been a discussion that has been ongoing for a long time. And actually many of the things that are being said are not that new, but there is this sense of this feeling of urgency and newness as well in the Netherlands. And I would like to talk today a little bit about what are the things that are continuities of earlier discussions, and what is actually really new. One funny thing about that newness of this discussion was when we presented the new Canon of the Netherlands. And the Canon of the Netherlands was introduced in 2006, and it contains 50 windows onto the history of the Netherlands. And a committee of wise historians collected these 50 windows and said, well, these are all the things that elementary school, primary school children should learn about the Netherlands, should be taught about the Netherlands. And of course, after a while, this needs to be updated. So I was in a committee that presented this updated version of the Dutch canon. And one of the things people kept saying about our new sort of update was, oh yes, and now slavery is in there too. But it had been already all along. It had been there since 2006. But all these commentators and journalists thought, well, this slavery thing, that's really new, that we're finally talking about it. But it's not that new, and things have been we have been talking about it for a while. What is I think is new is the kind of scale that we are addressing it with, and also this sense of wanting to give new perspectives and wanting to tell new stories about this history. But really an urge, and you can see it, I think, very forcefully in the new Rijksmuseum exhibition, where the curators of the exhibition, Valika Smulders and Evelien Sint-Nicolaas, have said that the audio tour to the exhibition is not optional, but it's, well, not they didn't say mandatory, but they said it is an integral part of the exhibition because we use oral history sources. And so I think you can get a sense of that wish to have these new perspectives, to have new sources, to not only have written sources included in that story for an institution that is really one of the cornerstones of the Central Museum of Dutch History and Art, to do such a thing and to want to talk about this and using these oral history sources. All right, so a lot is happening, but I think it is good to understand where that is coming from, what the sources are for these new perspectives and these new debates, and to really look at who have carried that history into the Netherlands and into the consciousness, the public consciousness about this history. And I think that is a story that importantly was also shaped by descendants of the enslaved. And if we look at the way the descendants of the enslaved remembered slavery, we can see quite a bit of diversity in how they, as a community, or not even one community, but as different groups, have chosen to remember that history. For one part, there was quite a group of people who really did want to forget about that history of slavery, who said that through education and through having business careers, we can prosper, and we shouldn't dwell too much on that history, especially those who were descendant of people who were manumitted before the abolition of slavery in 1863, trying to have these careers in the colony, in international business. They moved out of Suriname, for example, to try and work in the United States, in the Netherlands, in other places in the Caribbean. And they were really keen on, well, trying to forget that that history. Others were not able to make that kind of move, or are unwilling to do that. For example, people who were remaining at the plantations in a colony like Suriname. And there we have several examples of, especially from the district of Para, where the formerly enslaved bought the plantations that they had lived on, for generations. They bought these plantations, they stayed there, and they made that part of their history, that was about slavery, just a part of the story of their community. And so they had a specific remembrance, a memory of slavery, and they carried a very specific memory of slavery. Others, again, were Maroons. Quite a few Maroon groups existed and exist to this day in Suriname. And they have that history of slavery as just one part of their history of their community, but are very proud of being independent from colonial power since the 18th century. But it's also a narrative about that history of slavery that they have carried with them. And what is interesting is that during decolonization, so many migrants moved from the colonies to the Netherlands. And they took these stories with them, and the different communities took their different interpretations of that history of slavery with them to the Netherlands. And some of it also became quite politicized. So you had people arriving in the 1970s and 1980s, arriving in the Netherlands, bringing with them their political organizations, and building campaigns of solidarity about, for example, housing and housing discrimination, building campaigns of solidarity with other marginalized groups, and really beginning to develop a story about their part in Dutch history that was quite political. And one of the sources for their activism, and one of the sources for that story, was the writings of Anton de Kom. And Anton de Kom was a man from Suriname who had tried to have a career in business, had been blocked because of the color of his skin, moved to the Netherlands, tried to have a career there, built a family with a Dutch wife, moved back to Suriname, became caught up in a small, protest movement, and was deported to the Netherlands, where he wrote a book about the history of Suriname, We Slaves of Suriname, that history of Suriname, his experience, centering on that idea of slavery, overcoming slavery, and fighting against colonial oppression and racism. And that book was largely forgotten, but with those politicized groups that arrived in the 1990s and 1970s and 1980s, they rediscovered the work of Anton de Kom and decided to really bring that history of slavery as a defining a point in their own political identities, but also in what they tried to fight for, to get this attention for that history of slavery as a sort of a moral argument for being included in the Netherlands. We have the right to be here, and we have the right to be part of the Dutch nation because we have that shared history of slavery. That is absolutely not the mainstream of those Afro-Caribbean people who arrived in the Netherlands. There were also many groups who had a much more contemplative approach to the history, tried to search for the legacies of that history within their community, try to think about how is slavery still shaping our lives, should we, how can we come to terms with it, and we're not interested in that political fight. But taken together, we see that a kind of movement evolves that has, for different reasons, this idea that we need to address that history of slavery, we need attention for that history of slavery, and that attention needs to be on a national and a political level. And that movement becomes successful in the late 1990s, because there are two parties in government that are open to that conversation and taking up that issue. It's the PvdA, which is the Dutch Labour Party, and D66, which is similar to the Liberal Democrats. And these two parties were quite open to, well, doing something around this issue, or trying to, well, at least do something on that level of supporting that community in their demands there. So this all resulted in a monument, two monuments, a fixed monument, this one in 2002, and a institute, the NINSE, the Dutch Institute for Slavery History, which had both a educational and a research part. Yes, it's moving. Okay. No, let me go back. Well, all right. But I think the contradictions of that approach and of that movement were extremely clear in 2002 with the unveiling of that monument. So this has been a history of political groups, of activist groups, of groups who are well, trying to have these inward explorations of what does this history mean for us. And all of a sudden they're raised to that national level and that national conversation and have to deal with bigger political agendas. And that leads to a lot of friction and a lot of tension between these groups, but also with that national level. Because, for example, to just give a few examples, the minister who is addressing the crowd at the unveiling of this monument, he is not going to talk about colonial slavery there. He does mention it, but then he goes on and talks about forced labor nowadays, because that is for him and his party the relevance of what's going on there. He doesn't want to address the issue of racism and of the legacies of colonial slavery. So there is a disconnect between wanting recognition from that national level and at the same time that national level appropriating and using that theme for their own agenda. And the second, and that's the most painful, I think, of these, of what happened on that day, on the 1st of July in 2002, is that the unveiling was done by the Queen. And if you remember that time, 2002, it was just after 9/11, the attacks in Washington and New York. It was just after the murder of Pim Fortuyn, a very outspoken right-wing political candidate in the Netherlands. It was also just after the murder of Theo van Gogh, just 150 meters from the place where the monument was being unveiled. So having the most prominent people in the country, the minister and the king, or the queen then, and the later king as well, descending on that small park, and all the security measures that were being taken meant that only invited people were there at the unveiling. And that entire community of slave descendants who had lobbied and mobilized and for this were excluded quite violently. So dogs and police, and well, there was fighting, and it was really a very nasty scene. So really, I think, a tragedy of what can happen if you well, you want recognition on a national level, but then the kind of situation they ended up in there. Ninse itself was really caught between representing a community, representing quite broad groups, and trying to have that national recognition. And that national recognition was actually deteriorating. And it was deteriorating up to such a point that in 2013, at the 150-year anniversary of the history of slavery, the institute was defunded and abolished. So there was no more money for it. It was the end. So you can understand that in 2014, a group of young activists, and you see them here, entered the commemoration, and they prevented the Minister of Social Services from speaking. And they gave their own speech saying, well, we are as much Dutch, we're as Dutch as anybody else. We want to be recognized, and we want recognition of that history. The current king is very aware of that history and the relationship with, or seems to be quite aware of the relationship between that community, commemorative community, and well, his own position. Here you see him at the 150-year commemoration, where he just stands with these, or walks past these people who are protesting and arguing for recognition. So a very consciously different approach than in 2002 with all the security. Since 2002, 2013, what we have seen is a decentralization of the commemoration. So this is the monument in Amsterdam in 2002, and very soon after, other places, other cities also began to pay attention to this history, or wanted to address this history somewhat. Here you see Middelburg, the main port for the slave trade, and this is on the square across from their historic city hall. Placed this monument to remember the slave trade. Rotterdam, another major port, also added a monument in 2013 with 150-year commemoration. This is, I think, one of the well, more interesting ones. This is a statue for Bomservo Eliezer, who was an enslaved African who was buried alongside his owner on the Jewish cemetery in Bethlehem in Ouderkerk aan de Amstel. And in 2013, this was unveiled there. And every year, groups of mainly Afro-Surinamese go to the Jewish cemetery, and they have a joint commemoration together with the Jewish community. 2018, Hoofddorp in the Haarlemmermeer also wanted a monument. In the middle, you see the woman who took the initiative. For years, she said, we want a place for contemplation. We want a place that's close to water. And local political party said, yes, let's do it. And so very quickly they arranged for this place with a little bench and some text as well. But there has also been sort of pushback against all of this. So on the one hand, we see this community struggling for recognition, noticing how difficult it is to get that national recognition, and also finding out that it's maybe not, that the national recognition is maybe not really what you wanted. So going through that entire complex saga of we want to be recognized, but also want structural change in the position of Afro-Dutch people. And at the same, well, parallel to this, you see the development of new political parties in the Netherlands, a whole range of them, who use opposition to the attention to slavery really as part of their program, who use that opposition to the recognition of slavery and opposition to the monuments of slavery as a way to signal to their constituents that they are serious about defending, white Dutch rights. Very outspoken was Rita Verdonk, who was of the center-right, used to be of the center-right VVD party. She was Minister of Justice, but then she split from that and founded her own party. And at the start, at the founding of the party, she gave a speech, and one of her points was no more monuments for slavery. It has to be, which is curious, and you wonder why is it such a bad thing to have monuments for slavery. Part might be personal here, because she was booed quite heavily when she attended the commemoration a few years earlier. But it is interesting that she took it as such a central point for her party. No more monuments for slavery. The first who actually put something along those lines in his political program was Geert Wilders in 2006. In 2006, in his first political program, he says we should be proud of the era when the Dutch flag was flying across the seas. Rhetoric that might be familiar to you here. And here you have him depicted himself as Michiel de Ruiter. And well, that's not so strange, because Michiel de Ruiter is a national hero. He has been part of the Dutch canon since whenever he died. But this takes a very clearly a colonial celebrationist tone when you see in the background the enemy ship, the pirate ship, which has the flag of the Dutch Antilles, or the old flag of the Dutch Antilles. So you have him really going to war against those Dutch colonies, and pairing that with a lot of rhetoric against Antillean youth in the city of Rotterdam and elsewhere. So also really taking that colonial narrative on board. And here we have our latest in this line, which is Thierry Baudet. And here he is during Black Lives Matter protests last year. He went to lay flowers at various colonial monuments. And this is interestingly the most contentious of all Dutch colonial monuments. This is the monument for Jan Pieterszoon Koen. And Jan Pieterszoon Koen, even in the 17th century, people were appalled by, Dutch directors of the East India Company were appalled by what he was doing. He committed complete genocide of the Banda Islands. And he was only resurrected in the late 19th century during the IHR Wars, when the Ministry of the Colonies was on the board of a group that set up this monument. So very clearly, just showing that you take that colonial pride as a sort of a rallying call for your constituents. But as you might have noticed, this is something that has become more marginal or less mainstream in the last few years. So this claim to colonial pride and the claim to opposition to these new narratives of slavery is becoming more extreme, but also a little bit more marginalized. And I'm really not so sure why that is, and we can talk about that in the discussion. But I think it's really noticeable how in the Dutch culture sector, a lot of institutions, museums, and research institutions are turning towards addressing colonial history in new ways. And one of the starts of this maybe was a meeting organized by the Minister of Culture and Education in 2017. She had several meetings with similar people in 2016, but this was really a large gathering in 2017 where she really pushed directors of museums to begin to address this history and to use it as a way to begin to have well, a cooperation between these institutions and addressing new topics in new ways. So begin to innovate and change themselves. That was not to everybody's liking, of course. Also historians were opposed to that kind of well, almost political intervention here. You see, for example, our colleague Piet Emmer wrote a pamphlet in 2017 warning against what he called a iconoclastic fury, Beeldenstorm, iconoclastic fury against colonial history, and he urged for, well, not destroying all the old monuments, and actually also opposed to reinterpreting that history. This was taken up by the Telegraaf newspaper. This is a front page, 17th of January 2018. Front page said, "Stop the Beeldenstorm, iconoclastic fury." And already there you can see, well, the poor the poor Johan Maurits van Nassau-Siegen is beheaded here by the newspaper. But you can see actually a foreshadowing of the discussion will go to the Golden Carriage, because they already included it themselves, not knowing that it would indeed get on the agenda not much later. But it is interesting to see how this debate is developing. That on the one hand, you see a community really able to gain a foothold in many cities and gain an audience to address this history. Really interesting to see also the role that different historians have played in this. We have seen many cities writing small booklets about the local histories of slavery, and some have done really bigger research projects like Amsterdam and Rotterdam. But an interesting development in the last few years. Before I would like to close with the trailer of the Rijksmuseum exhibition to give you a sense of really what they're trying to do. But first, I'm going to do something that historians rarely do, and that's predicting the future. Where is this all going? And that is probably we're quite probably heading to apologies, formal apologies to slavery. And we have seen some signs leading up to this. It has become more normal in Dutch society to apologize for historic wrongs. It took quite a while for the National Rail Service, but in 2008 they apologized for the deporting of Dutch Jews during the war, during the Second World War, the occupation. They have apologized for this, and they have apologized for making a profit while doing it. And they are now, this year, beginning to pay out, and you realize that this is that very few people are still alive, but they're only now recognizing this and beginning to pay out compensation and supporting the museum for the Holocaust Museum in the Netherlands. So this is well, a sign of something very well, maybe a little bit bigger changing in that society, about wanting to well, be open about what has been going on in the past, even the history of the war, which we all thought had been dealt with and addressed, but this is slowly happening now. Another one are the colonial wars just after the Second World War. Immediately after the Second World War, the Dutch went to war in Indonesia, trying to prevent independence. And here the king, last year visiting Indonesia, apologized. He apologized very specifically for excessive violence that took place. But that is, in Dutch terms, really quite a big step, acknowledging that anything had been had gone wrong in that history, and we now see slowly a move towards apologies for slavery. And in a way, this seems even harder than all the other ones for many different reasons, but not taking descendants of the enslaved serious has been a sort of staple in the Dutch identity, and this is clearly changing. When asked about, are you in support of apologies for slavery, 55% of Dutch people said that they were against, and some 30-something said that they were for it. And you can say that that is a lot of people against, but I was actually quite optimistic about it, because a few years ago that would have been different. And if you look at who are taking these positions, then you see also interesting differences. For example, people who migrated from Indonesia, so post-colonial migrants from Indonesia, were quite strongly opposed to apologies for slavery, probably because they were part of the colonial hierarchy, were not so and really part of a quite racist system. But newer migrants, especially from Turkey and Morocco, are really very heavily in favor of these kinds of apologies. And well, we'll have to find out why that is. But meanwhile, this means that there is a lot of research being done, a lot of thinking being done about can you apologize for this? What happens if you do this? We have a dialogue going on, organized by the current Minister of Culture and Education, and I think that the cities of Amsterdam and Rotterdam will apologize for slavery this year, and well, in all likelihood, we will be moving to sort of a national apology in 2023, and maybe also a national museum for the history of slavery by then. All right. So I would like to end on that note, but not before I've shown you the trailer of the Rijksmuseum, which I think shows you quite well what kind of new perspectives they try to show in this exhibition. Let me see if this works. No. Mm-hmm. Can you see it? Okay.
We can see, but it's still loading, and I'm not sure we can hear it yet.
Ah. Okay, I'm going to try one more time. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to stop. I'll leave it at that, and hope you will be able to visit in the next 3 months when the exhibition is on.
Super. Thank you so much for a fascinating overview, both of the kind of exhibition that we all really hope to be able to get to, and escape, across the channel from, or across oceans. I don't know where. It's a rather broad audience again. Luckily, because I think this raises so many interesting questions and conversations about commemoration and about scholarship and about apologies that are both very local and very international. And I think that I hope that comes together here from this very international audience as well. Practical tools. Everyone is very welcome to raise questions. You can do that by raising your hand, by hitting the reactions button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom, or you can say in the chat that you want to ask a question and then grab the mic if I call on you, or you can type the question there if you prefer not to speak it out loud, and I'll read it myself. So everyone very welcome to discuss anything you want to talk with our speaker about. Okay. Oh, there's already a hand. Claudia, do you take the mic?
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much. It was fascinating. I mean, and so important. I wonder if you have thoughts you want to share on the tension between commemorating individual stories and the larger phenomenon of slavery as such. I mean, that for me is one of the reasons I'm fascinated. I really hope I can see the exhibition. I'm not sure I can, but you know, the choice that the Rijksmuseum curators made, or the teams of people working on the exhibition made, to focus on 10 individual lives is of course an interesting one, and of course an informed one. And then, you know, if you counter the I mean, I just wonder if you have thoughts about that, because of course the bewogen beeld of Johan Maurits, that exhibition at the Mauritshuis, was also generated or came to being around problems with an individual, and you know, the way in which you showed how politicians have aligned themselves with individuals, and then I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yes, I think that this exhibition, well, it had been long in the making, and we had a lot of discussion. I was part of the I don't know what the word is, sounding board, but I think it starts from such a deep understanding of the structural nature of slavery, that it doesn't run the risk that you see, that you can have sort of, well, this is one individual story. But if you look at the catalog that they made with the exhibition, and you read through the catalog, you see that these small one individual stories are really used to say something about the larger phenomenon. That's how they have been chosen very specifically. So they really wanted to say something about how does the Dutch Republic end up as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Well, we need to tell a story about Dutch Brazil. Mm-hmm. What kind of story can we tell about Dutch Brazil? So then they have João, an enslaved African who flees from the Portuguese side to the Dutch side, who is then questioned, and they have his questioning as a starting point. But that is embedded in how does someone like João end up there? How was it part of Dutch power projection, international politics, and a transformation of thinking about race, especially around the period of Brazil. So maybe that's a too optimistic reading of my on my side, but I think the exhibition is not sort of telling these 10 stories, and people have to figure it out themselves. And that is, I think, the criticism that people have about it, is that it's not the stories, the individual stories are not multifocal. So the individual stories, you're really guided to interpret them in a certain way. Yeah, it's quite forceful in how they guide you to interpret them.
Yeah, I guess just for purposes of clarification, and thank you very much for your answer, which goes a long way. I think it's the specificity of your presentation, well, your work, but also your presentation today in charting out a variety, not only a variety of, well, I mean, referring to various forms of slavery, of course, but also a variety of histories of you know, the local histories. And so I just wonder, because Holland does seem to me to be, or the Netherlands seems to me to be unique in that sense, that slavery was conducted across so many other places. And so as an institution, whether, you know, how we grapple with the relationship between the individual story and the institution. But I don't want to take more time. I just want to say that was sort of what I was getting at in a, yeah.
But there you see that there is in the Atlantic world, there is it becomes all very similar. Mm-hmm. It starts out as really different kinds of slavery, very different institutions, and differences remain. Suriname and Curacao are really quite different, and this has been one of the more difficult parts. How do you include Asia in this? Because there are so many forms of forced labor mobilization that are really not slavery in the as defined by the colonial state. They are, of course, slavery according to our modern definitions, but a lot of things are slavery according to that modern definition, but not losing sight of the specificities. And I think they had an interesting move with the Van Bengalen. So you have 10, right? You have 10 individual stories, they say, but one is Van Bengalen. And the point there is that many people were called Van Bengalen. Mm. And so they have a group of people under that to show you the different places people could end up, and that they were part of that slavery. So for a first big national exhibition on slavery, I think there is quite an understanding of the complexity of taking sort of this transhistoric concept and applying it in this way. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Fascinating, thank you. Anne, you were first on my list.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on what the discussions were like as a member of the Canon committee. What did you feel people felt needed to be changed, considering that there were only 7 years between the first Canon and the second one? I'd just be fascinated in a sort of oral history sense to hear your views.
I'm not allowed to say. No, it's I cannot speak about the internal discussions we had within the Canon committee.
Okay.
But no, it's not 7 years. It's 15 years. So 2006,
15. Okay, sorry.
2020.
Yeah.
But what we did with many of those windows was to place them in an international context and to say this is not just Dutch, this is part of a broader world. So if we talk about William of Orange, then we don't just talk about him as, and I mean William the Silent, we don't talk about him as the father of the fatherland, but also about him as an international operating prince who had different areas where he tried to operate, and the Dutch Republic was one of them. So so those international connections and international relevance and exchange were really part of one of the things that I really had attention for when looking at the different windows on that history. Okay. We had been asked initially by the minister to address specifically the position of women in history and what were called the shadow sides of our history. But then Parliament intervened and said that the minister was not allowed to give us that kind of instruction. So we were free to do as we pleased. And there are more women in the canon now than there were. But not on a ministerial instruction. And the shadow sides of history were already there, so we didn't specifically do anything with that. Yeah, so having a canon is an interesting thing because it leads to a lot of conversations, and it helps to have sort of a set number of things to talk about. It does, of course, create a kind of national, a certain kind of nationalism, methodological nationalism. Well, I'm quite positive about the kind of conversations that you can have because we have it.
Great, thank you. I'd love to talk to you about this more privately sometime. Sure. Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. So many interesting ways in which history is being done. Over to Reinier, you're next on my list. You're still muted.
Am I on?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm Reinier Salvador of University College London. I wanted to say thank you very much for this clear and thoughtful presentation. It couldn't have been more topical than today, because today the BBC has a very big item on the Rijksmuseum exhibition, which is worth seeing for all of you, in addition to this talk. My question is about, your topic is slavery, and that is at the moment very topical in Dutch political and historical discussion. But where do we go from here? And here I'm thinking of a slightly different exhibition, which is running at the National Archive in The Hague, a very interesting exhibition where you see the Plakkaat van Verlating, the the great document against the Spanish king who we abolished in 1581. And there is a letter written by 200 women from Amsterdam in 1795 demanding their rights alongside the men who wrote the Declaration of Rights. And there is, as a third item in the exhibition, the correspondence between the slave leader Koffie and the Dutch governor in Berbice in 1763, when there was a great slave uprising in Berbice, 100 years before the official recognition of independence or the abolition of slavery in the Dutch kingdom. And I was struck by that exhibition because it reaches out to three very different constituencies of the population, the slaves and their uprising, the women and their demands, and the traditional historians maybe who still take our departure from the Spanish and the liberation of the Dutch nation as a crucial event in Dutch history. And reaching out to these three very different constituencies might offer a sort of pathway, a creative link at least, that historians need to think about. What is the connection between those three? Is it, as that exhibition seems to suggest, they are all about liberation within a Dutch context, so it matters for all of us in the Netherlands? Or is it just a fortuitous a jumbling together of things that happened without any deeper meaning? But I think it does present a sort of perspective for how we could move forward in linking, forging alliances between different constituencies that have been, well, involved with struggles for liberation and righting of wrongs in the past. What do you think of that suggestion?
Yes, well, it is. It has been quite a creative way to do that. I think practically, if you ask me where next, well, having this sink in is of course a big, still a big thing. Where next, as the Rijksmuseum or the issue of the independence war of Indonesia is bound to really keep us busy for a couple of years in when it comes to the public history and public debates, because we are all opposed to slavery and have always been. So there is some kind of common ground, but when it comes to the history of Indonesia and if independence was a good thing, then we are really much deeper divided. So I wonder how that conversation will go. And there are big research projects going on. So I think that is something that I will witness with a bit more distance, but we'll see happening. I think that will be next. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yasmin, you've got your hand up.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I hope this isn't too off topic, but there's a really big debate happening right now about a piece that Dirk Moses wrote about debates in Germany over comparisons between the Holocaust and the genocide of the Herero and Nama. And this is all kind of going back to the discussion by Michael Rothberg about multi-directional memory. And I wondered if you could give your perspective on how you see Holocaust memory and memory of colonialism and slavery in the Netherlands interacting today.
Yeah, important question. Johandi Hartendorp is writing her PhD at in Utrecht, and she is looking at the way in which school teachers address both histories. not just the methodology, not the books, but really just physically in class. What do they do? How do they interact? No, it's too big a question, I'm afraid. I wouldn't know where to start, because there are so many aspects of this. No, I'm not going. I'm not going there for now.
I guess maybe instead of just answering that really big question, I mean, do you think that the two movements have influenced each other, or do you think that they're happening at the same time but very separately and not maybe borrowing from one another? Yeah,
there's absolutely clear borrowing, right? So the movement for the recognition of slavery borrows and compares a lot. So yes, that I see quite clearly, and there is also a sense of competition sometimes. So we had some uproar 2 years ago when someone published a not very well done study that said, well, there is more attention to the history of colonialism in Dutch school books than there is to the Holocaust. And so, playing them off against each other and then having a debate. It mostly has been borrowing and trying to follow that pattern, saying, well, we need one day to commemorate and one day to celebrate, for example, which is something that has been part of that approach of the war. But no, it's yeah. For the rest, it's too big a question, I think, to really address
it. Thank you. I had Reinier, is that follow up on this? Go on.
Yeah. Let me see.
Oh, you're no longer muted, so we can hear you.
Okay.
Now you are muted.
Oh, I can't hear you.
Good. Yep. Here I am again.
Yes.
Okay. Just a comment to the question of Yasmin. From a Black perspective, it occurs to me that Aimé Césaire has, in his reflections on colonialism, quite clearly stated that the Blacks have been the subject of 400 years of really terrible treatment, and it was only when the say the Germans hit out on the Jews that this was a new thing in Europe, but that Blacks as subjects of slavery had been at the receiving end of such treatment for 400 years. And another comment also from a Black colleague, our own great writer Frank Martinez Arion, in a very interesting little book from 1999 about Dutch discussions about slavery, says, when you raise this question in the Netherlands, the discussion of the Holocaust fills everyone with awe and pain and deep regret and sorrow. But when you raise this question about slavery in Holland, people just laugh. And I don't know a more terrible indictment of the Dutch mentality in dealing with this question. I think it's a very fair question that you're asking, and it needs further investigation. So if you are doing that or know people who do that, yes, please continue, because they are not unconnected, different niche fields, I would think. And it's worth drawing out the connections there are there. Good luck.
Absolutely. Ben, you've got a question.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah. Hi, Karwan. I was wondering. I mean, here in London, in fact, at UCL, there's been a long-standing, now 10 or more years, ongoing project called Legacies of British Slave Ownership, which was initiated by Catherine Hall and has, gained legs of its own, and periodically produces revelations that make it into the news. And its approach, well, it took off from an analysis of money. I mean, the guiding thread has been about the wealth and the estates that and the corporations now that owe initial capital to slave ownership, and the reimbursements, the monies that were paid at the abolition of slave ownership in the country. I was just wondering, out of ignorance, whether that historical thread has been pursued in the Netherlands too, and whether there's been investigation into the the current debts that different constituencies in the country have to wealth derived from slavery.
Yes, this follow the money approach, yeah, is taken. More and more families are interested in where did our family wealth come from? Was it connected to slavery? The Van Loon Museum, which is the beautiful house on the Dutch Canal, or on the Amsterdam Canal, they have a Moor's head in their family crest, and they've always avoided talking about it or about the history of slavery connected to their family. And well, after that call by Bussemaker and other developments, they decided, well, we need to address it, and they made a very interesting exhibition involving both their family and the descendants who had come from the plantations that were partly owned by that family. Those were some uncomfortable conversations, but I think good conversations to have. And other people have taken that up. And very concretely, I've been commissioned by the Dutch National Bank to do an investigation into their own connection to the history of slavery, which actually was directly inspired by the Bank of England and Lloyd's Bank research. So that's going on, and what I think is interesting about it is that it's not the kind of banks and slavery research that we have seen from American banks, because you had those American laws, Chicago, some other places passed the laws saying, well, if you want to be active in our state, you have to tell us if you were connected to slavery. And then you get a very sort of formal report saying, well, we looked it up and there was some more mortgages here and there was, etc. And that's it. But what the Dutch National Bank has asked for is not only the institution itself, but also the main actors, the main directors and presidents of the bank, and their involvement privately in slavery, and their role in the debates around slavery. And so being involved in the politics of it. So that's interesting, and it might be funny to know that at the meeting with Jet Bussemaker, the Minister of Education in 2017, Catherine Hall was there to give a presentation. So it all ties together.
I see. Thanks.
That was actually tying into the kind of question that I was wondering about, because I'm intrigued by the timeline of this kind of commemoration, and then forgetting, and then very politicized, and it doesn't map on to timelines elsewhere. I feel like this is an internal Dutch story, or is it like how much like influence from other reckonings with the past that you're seeing elsewhere? Yeah. How much is that shaping what is going on in the conversation in the Netherlands?
Yeah, so the flare-ups of the debate about the statues is always triggered by the outside. So 2015, Roads Must Fall movement in South Africa, that immediately has people asking, is this going on in the Netherlands as well? right? And so you see that a newspaper cover is a response to that. And if some Confederate general is pulled off his pedestal in the US, also in 2015, so you had Rosemas Fall starting in 2015, and then new attention to that same thing that had already, of course, been going on in the US for a long time about these Confederate monuments. That then triggers a lot of debate in the Netherlands about should we also do that to our own monuments or not, even without anybody asking for it, right? So they call me and they say, "Oh, can you come to the studio? We're going to discuss about this pulling down of these monuments." And I always have to ask, okay, but is there anybody who's actually planning this or doing it, or are we talking about anything real? We never are. There's been one protest. Well, there was during the Black Lives Matter, there was a little wave of mainly Moroccan activists attacking the VOC related statues, yeah, no, it is a lot of noise about things that are going on abroad when it comes to the statues, and to delegitimize what's going on in the museums, people will say that it is American, right? You're importing things from America, etc. But it's simply not the case. So it's really just a local reckoning that's going on, and that will be even stronger with Indonesia, which is going to be much more, I think, Dutch contained. If you see footage from there, my only frame of reference is Vietnam. We have some colored footage from that war, but yes, no, I think that will be something else probably. But yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, because it's so intriguing, all those stakeholders in that kind of commemorating and studying and reckoning, and everyone with their own agendas, maybe not always the most positive and constructive kind of agendas in making it like, oh, this is international kind of situation. Yeah. I don't see any hands at the moment, so if you still want to raise questions, now is your chance to jump in. If not, I'm going to start rounding up because we've been making you talk formally for a long time, and just to say thank you for ending our year of seminars on such a fantastic note, like really highlighting the importance of doing history in a way as well, and thinking about this and actually debating it. I think you're stressing of the canon, and actually saying like, these are good debating points. These bring people to actually talk about history.
Lisbeth, Margot had a question.
Yeah. Oh, is that okay? Do go ahead,
Margot.
Sorry, I didn't see a hand.
Actually, I was clapping. I thought it was a wonderful presentation.
Excuse me.
No, I have thousands of questions, but too many. Thank you.
Sorry.
Clapping is encouraged, because that was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.